President Trump appearing in the White House briefing room last night with unsubstantiated claims of fraud.
John Schierick is fact-checking what he said about Georgia.
President Trump says his opponents in toss-up states across the country have been trying to rig and steal the election from his voters. He cited irregularities during the vote processing. He mentioned the water pipe leak in Fulton County Tuesday night that interrupted the absentee vote process at State Farm Arena.
In Georgia, a pipe burst in a faraway location, totally unrelated to the location of what was happening, and they stopped counting for 4 hours, and a lot of things happened.
According to Fulton County and 11 Alive's reporter on the scene, the leak came from a room directly above the vote tabulators, not from a faraway location, and that the tabulating was delayed briefly during the repairs, less than 2 hours. The president also questioned why his big lead in Georgia dwindled after Tuesday.
Likewise in Georgia, I won by a lot, with a lead of over getting close to 300,000 votes on election night in Georgia, and by the way, got whittled down.
We looked again at the vote totals as they were beginning to come in Tuesday night, and in fact, President Trump was leading in early returns by some 300,000 votes. But his lead dwindled when votes from more populous areas of historically Democrat voters were counted. Neither he nor Biden had won Georgia as of Thursday evening at the time of his remarks. The president also said that he's losing in states where he should be winning because of Democrats, including in Georgia.
The election apparatus in Georgia is run by Democrats.
Georgia's Secretary of State, who is in charge of elections, is a Republican, Brad Raffensperger, a constitutional officer elected statewide. His three predecessors going back to 2007 were Republicans. Raffensperger chairs the bipartisan State Elections Board. And local elected officials are hired by county governments that are run by a mix of Republicans and Democrats.
President Trump said again last night that he will pursue options in court. He did not say specifically whether he would target Georgia continually in those litigation options. Our team is working hard to verify claims and point out any misinformation out there surrounding the election. If you have something you'd like us to verify, send us an email to verify@11alive.com.